to another training on the T here, Tuesday. Today, we're going to be focused on Power BI administration and talking through the capabilities primarily through the Power BI service to be able to administrate and monitor, not necessarily monitor, but to be able to administrate your Power BI solutions that you've designed. So we'll get into things like deployment, we'll talk about collaboration and sharing with others, security, data refresh, and we'll even get into, if we have some time towards the end, there's a lot of topics there, but we'll also get into looking at the admin portal a little bit if we have some time. All right, real quickly, if you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Devin Knight. I'm the president of training here at Pragmatic Works. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. That just means I do a lot of things like this to help evangelize the tools. I've also authored 7 books that are related to SQL Server, BI, and Power BI. And this is more just to let you know where I'm from. I'm a contributing member at the Jacksonville Power BI user group. So that just tells you I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. You can also find my blog at devinknightsql.com, where I have a lot of blogs around Power BI. I usually do at least a monthly video talking about what are the latest updates that have come out with Power BI and what are the most interesting ones to me. You can also find my Twitter and email address there if you want to reach out later. All right, so again, our session today is going to be focused on some of the administrative tasks within inside of Power BI. So we'll talk about deployment, which you'll find oftentimes deployment is not relegated to specific DBA necessarily. This might actually be something that your users will do themselves. We'll also talk about collaboration and sharing. So once you have a solution that's created, what's the proper means for sharing it with others? There's actually a lot of different ways you can share solutions with others. We'll talk about the recommended ways by Microsoft. And then we'll also get into security. And when I say security here, it's more data level security, making sure that individuals can see only the data they're supposed to see whenever they go and look at your reports that you've designed. Okay, and then finally, of course, an important one is data refresh. There's a lot of things to consider when you're working with data refreshes. We'll look into that as well. All right, so first things first, let's talk about deployment. So if you are working with Power BI, there are 2 methods for deploying. There's a cloud deployment method, and there's an on-prem or on-premises deployment method that you can choose from. That's for customers that, for whatever reason, there's various reasons why you might not have chosen to go to the cloud yet. If that's the case for you, then you might be using a tool called the Power BI Report Server. That is essentially the same thing as reporting services for being able to deploy your reports to. The other option, of course, is the cloud service, which is called Power BI Service. That's done at powerbi.com, where you can deploy any reports you've designed there. Now, there are a few differences between the two, so I thought I'd mention them lightly here. Again, I'm going to focus primarily on the cloud service today, but maybe a follow-up webinar is to focus on the on-premises capabilities as well. But a couple key differences to understand between the 2 different deployment methods. If you are working with the cloud service, then you have things like the ability to deploy to Workspaces, and you have dashboards that you can set up, and you can use the most up-to-date version of the Power BI desktop to be able to create content that you're going to eventually deploy. Whereas if you're using the on-premises method, there is no such thing as dashboards. As far as the terminology that Microsoft uses of what's a dashboard, dashboard is something that's fed from one of the reports that you create. So you create a report, and then you can pin individual items from that report to a dashboard. The Power BI Report Server doesn't have a concept of dashboard. So whenever you go to deploy a report to the on-premises Power BI Report Server, then the report is kind of the final solution. You deploy the report out and you're done. You don't have to go then create additional dashboards on top of it. You also, when you're looking at the on-premises solution, you have the ability to deploy to folders rather than a workspace. So a workspace is the feature that you have inside of the cloud service for deploying to, and you can set up security at that level. That same kind of concept exists within inside the Power BI Report Server, the on-prem method, but it's just done with folders. Okay. Now, the other thing that's worth mentioning here is there are 2 different versions of the Power BI desktop, depending on whether or not you're using the cloud version of Power BI, or if you're using the non-cloud, the Power BI Report Server method. And you should be aware of that, because if you're using the non-cloud version, then you need to have a separate Power BI desktop installed, which you can find here. I've already downloaded it. I just downloaded the most up-to-date version today to make sure I had the right one. But you'll want to search for something called the Power BI Desktop Optimized for Power BI Report Server, and the latest version is May. Now, the key difference between those two is, and why it's labeled May and has a date labeled to it at all, is because the non-cloud, the Power BI report server, only gets certain updates periodically, but not as frequent as the cloud service does. So if you're using the non-cloud method, then you need to make sure that you're using a Power BI desktop that is compatible with the solution that the server that you're deploying to. And so that's why you'll actually see it labeled with May 2019, because that is the most up-to-date version of the tool that you can use. Okay. Now, for some folks, for some companies, we'll see they actually use both. There's some circumstances where companies may have some data that's not allowed to be in the cloud, but other data that's not really an issue. And so there's some benefits to using the cloud service, so they like to use it where they can. And then in areas where they're just not allowed to put data in the cloud, they revert back to the Power BI server, Power BI report server. So why is that important? Well, the reason we should know about those circumstances is because there may be some cases where you have 2, maybe even 3, Power BI desktops installed on your machine. So right now, I actually have 3 separate Power BI desktops installed on my machine. If I do a quick search in my Windows server here, you'll see I have 3 different instances of the Power BI desktop. There's this one up on the very top here. This one is something different. We're not going to talk about the Power BI report builder today, but I have the Power BI desktop that comes from the Windows store. So there's a Windows or Microsoft store where you can download that you can use. I also have the one that I downloaded from the web browser, where you can just go to powerbi.com and download it. And then the third one that I have, by the way, these first 2 are pretty much in sync. The nice thing about the one from the Windows store is it automatically updates for you. You don't have to go download updates. But then the final one that you'll see here is called the Power BI Desktop, which has May 2019 labeled on it. That's the most up-to-date version of the on-premises version of Power BI. Now, the reason I bring that up now is because it's good to know that the difference here is whenever you go to actually deploy, there is a different button that you'll click if you're deploying to the on-premises version of Power BI versus the cloud version. And so I'm going to launch this real quick just to show you briefly where you would actually click if you were using the non-cloud method versus the cloud method. Again, I'm going to focus mainly on the cloud method today, but I do want to at least do a little nod here to my non-cloud users to make sure they're on board with where we're going here. So if I was using the non-cloud version of the Power BI desktop, which is what you see here, you'll notice a few key differences. One is the color scheme is quite different. So if I launch the cloud version here, you'll see that they've changed the color over time recently. So not a big difference there. But the main difference when it comes to deployment is you'll notice there's not this publish button up here in the top of the non-cloud version. So here's the cloud version with the publish button, and here's the non-cloud version, does not have that publish button. So for my non-cloud users, what you would do is you would go up to the file menu and you'd say File, Save As, and then you'll see an option here called to Power BI report server, where you can save a copy to the Power BI report server. Okay, so keep that in mind if you are one of my non-cloud users. For my cloud users, you're going to just hit the publish button. In fact, if you're a cloud user and you're using the Power BI desktop, you don't see that same option. When you go to the file menu and hit Save As, you'll notice there is no little arrow that pops up to choose Power BI report server. If I were to hit Save As, it's going to prompt me to choose a file location where I want to save this copy of the file to. So big difference there is how you deploy. You would choose the publish option if you're using the cloud versus the Save As option if you're using the non-cloud option. All right, so real quickly, let's hop back over to the slides because I did jump ahead a little bit just to discuss the non-cloud version. But let's hop back because I do want to talk about this concept of workspaces a bit that we have here. So briefly, what a workspace is it's essentially like a virtual container, almost like a folder, where you can store the collateral that you've created inside of Power BI. So when you're working inside the Power BI desktop and you're ready to actually deploy to the Power BI service, you would hit the publish button and that would deploy 2 items. The 2 things that it deploys are reports and data sets. So whenever you hit publish from the Power BI desktop, it would publish any reports that you've created inside the Power BI desktop, and it would publish also the data sets. The data sets includes the data model, any kind of data extract capabilities that you've built in. So that would be like M code that you've written. All of that, and even DAX, is all encompassed inside of the data set. So the data set has all of that stored inside of it. So when I hit publish, it's going to publish those 2 things here off to the cloud. Now, you'll notice that whenever you actually hit the publish button, it gives you an option to choose which workspace you want to deploy to. So that likely means that you need to have a workspace created ahead of time. Now, for everybody, anyone that is a Power BI user, you will have this feature called a My Workspace right here that's already available to you. Now, I don't recommend deploying things that you really want to share with others there. Really, I typically use My Workspace as kind of the testing ground where I deploy things to it, see how it's going to work before I go share it with others in another created workspace. So while you can share things from your My Workspace, I don't recommend it. I would actually create a separate workspace, and then from that workspace, create an app. We'll get to the sharing capabilities a bit later. So the sharing and collaboration piece we'll get to. But everyone is going to have their own My Workspace, and it's independent to them. If you look at your My Workspace, it's going to be different than your neighbor's My Workspace. It's just kind of a testing ground. And for my folks that have been using reporting services in the past, this is kind of like having a My Reports folder in reporting services where you can kind of have your own little personal storage space for testing things out. Now, another thing, whenever you go to create a workspace, which I'm going to show you here in just a moment, is I always recommend having it at least more than one person be an admin of your workspaces that you create. So you're going to create a workspace that you're going to deploy things to, and you should have at least more than one person be an admin of that workspace. Why is that? Well, the main reason for that is because you're probably going to go on vacation at some point in your life, and things tend to go terribly wrong when you go on vacation, I'm sure, where things don't get, data doesn't get refreshed. Your people that you work with aren't able to kind of assist. That's one of the common things I see is people will go on vacation, or maybe you were a contractor somewhere and you left. If you're the only administrator of a workspace, it makes it very difficult for someone else to come in and help, and for someone else to come in and kind of troubleshoot why a data refresh didn't occur. So I always recommend having at least one other person be an admin of the workspaces that you create to have kind of that backup. And when you go, let's keep it nice when you go on vacation, okay? The sharing and collaboration side, we'll talk more about that later. So I'm just going to keep that in mind. If you're thinking, oh, hey, how do I share with others? We'll come back to that in a later section. All right, so two things I want to show you. First, I want to show you next, how do I create a workspace? So even before we deploy to the Power BI service, we need to create a workspace. So we'll walk you through that. And then we'll walk through the simple publishing, which is very straightforward. Really, this demo is more interesting from the creating of the workspace perspective. All right, so I'm going to go bring in my Power BI service that I have already signed into here. Let's see if I can get it on the right screen. There we go. And what I'd like to do is I want to create a new workspace, because right now, if everything I'm looking at is from the My Workspace perspective, where I have a bunch of kind of testing things that I've played around with. And what I'd like to do is I want to create a new workspace that I can deploy to for this solution. The benefit to doing that as well is it's going to come into play when it comes to the sharing and collaboration elements. So if I want to actually share with others from the workspace, I can create something called an app, which you see right here. And from that app that I create, I can share permissions to that app with my users, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the how do I create a workspace? Well, you'll find that underneath the Workspaces section right here. So if I expand Workspaces, you'll see a list of all the workspaces I have available to me that I can switch to. You can also search for them up top. But in my case, I want to create a new workspace, so I'll hit Create a Workspace on the bottom. All right, so I'll go ahead and select Create a Workspace. And you'll notice that right now, it's creating a newly upgraded workspace. You can definitely see some of the features that came along with the new upgraded workspace. Some of it that they did was decoupling a little bit from, I don't know if you guys noticed in the past, when you would create a workspace, it would also create like a Microsoft team for you. Some of that did some decoupling of that, and there's a few other benefits from the new workspaces you'll see as well. All right, but we're gonna go ahead and give this new workspace a name. So I'll call this something like Webinar Workspace. It's fine. You can give it a description if you'd like. And then one thing I'll highlight here under the advanced section, if you look under the advanced section, there's a few things here worthy of noting. You can add other administrators, of course. You can assign kind of where you want a OneDrive to be stored for any additional files that you may have, so you can optionally use that. The other thing here that a lot of people have interest in is this feature here called dedicated capacity. So I want to spend just a moment on this, and you'll notice mine is grayed out on purpose right now, but I'll explain that here for a moment. What dedicated capacity is this is what you likely have heard about called Power BI Premium. So Power BI Premium gives you your own dedicated resources, is another way of saying that, your own dedicated resources for your Power BI solutions to render, to run, to execute, to do everything they need. Briefly on this, Power BI Premium is designed so that it prevents when you deploy something to the cloud. So keep this in mind, when you deploy to the cloud, you're deploying your solution on a server that's shared with potentially dozens or even hundreds of other users. And what could happen potentially in those scenarios is that you could have a noisy tenant, meaning someone else that's on that server that is running some really nasty queries that's really bogging down the performance of that server. And so what Power BI Premium does is it gives you your own dedicated resources and prevents that from happening. So it's kind of preventing the possibility of someone else running this really nasty query that slows down your performance when you really have nothing to do with them. So that's kind of the idea of what Power BI Premium does at a high level. They've added a lot of other extra things to do with Power BI Premium that don't have anything to do with that, but that's the basis of what the dedicated capacity is here. The reason why you see mine grayed out is my Office 365 administrator has it turned off for my user account. I have another user account where it's turned on. I just don't need it for this day. All right, so I'll go ahead and hit save to save and create that workspace. Oh, and I did mention, hey, you might want to have more than one administrator. If you ever need to go back and add another administrator, you certainly can. You'll find that underneath. Let's see. Let me skip this here. There we go. You'll find the ability to add other administrators underneath. Oops, sorry, wrong zoom button. Underneath the access section here. So if I select access, I can then grant others the ability to have administrator capabilities to my workspace. So right now, Devonite is the only administrator, but I could add in another administrator here. Let's say I work with Mitchell Pearson and I want him to also be an administrator of this workspace whenever I'm on vacation. I can select that I want him to be an admin. By the way, there's a new feature in here called Viewer. That's fairly new. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about sharing and collaboration. But if I want an admin, an extra admin, then I can add Mitchell as an admin. Now, generally, the only reason why you're adding people to your workspace and giving people access to your workspace is if you intend for them to be a collaborative user with you, meaning that you intend for them to actually be developing Power BI solutions with you and also deploying to the same workspace. If you only have users that are going to be viewing reports that you've created and never going to be creating any content, they're just a viewer only, then you're generally going to be creating an app and sharing the app with them. So the workspace is not necessarily intended for viewer only, although there is a new viewer role that you have available here. Generally, it's recommended that you do apps for that. There's some benefits of that we'll talk about as we get moving forward. One analogy that actually Mitchell told me I thought was pretty good. You can think of workspace access as kind of like the behind the scenes kitchen. If you're in a restaurant, you have the front area where all the customers sit and eat their food, and then you have the back end area where the kitchen is and everyone is working to prepare the food. That's kind of like what workspace access is like. This is the back end kitchen. Apps are kind of going to be like your front end part of the restaurant that your consumers or your customers only see the things that are relevant to them. Okay. All right. So I'll go ahead and close this out. All right. And that now creates this workspace that I can deploy to. Now I do have a Power BI solution that's already created. It's not particularly advanced. It just has a couple charts and some slicers on it. And whenever I'm ready to actually publish this to the Power BI service, I would go up to the top right where you see the publish button and select publish. So I'll select publish here. All right. And from here, I can select the workspace that we just created. So I created a workspace called Webinar Workspace. I'll scroll down till I find that and go ahead and hit select. Now, this is going to require that you save a local copy of this file as well. So I've already saved a local copy of this previously. So I don't need to do anything necessarily extra to save because it was already saved. But this publishing step now is going to publish it not only locally, which has already been done, but now to the Power BI service. So you can see here, by the way, one thing I didn't mention is you do need to be signed in to publish to the Power BI service. You can see in the top right that I'm already signed in. You can see my name up top here. If I hadn't been signed in, it would have prompted me to sign in first, okay? Once you're done with that, though, you can actually open up from the Power BI desktop. You can click open here, and that will take you into the report that you were just viewing in the Power BI desktop, but now you'll be viewing it from within inside the Power BI service. Okay. All right, so pretty straightforward. Two things we did there. We created a workspace. We talked a little bit about the benefit of having a second admin in there in case you're not around whenever something goes wrong. You have someone else that can actually help. And then we did a quick deployment, very simple to do. All you have to do is hit the publish button and then select the workspace that you created. Okay. All right, let's flip back over here for a moment and talk next about sharing and collaboration. So we talked briefly about this, just kind of hinted to it a little bit. But the recommended way for sharing with more viewers, so think about this as the front end part of the kitchen, the part of the kitchen where you have your customer sitting, that's primarily going to be shared with from the Power BI apps section. Okay, so we're going to talk about apps. Apps are good for distributing the Power BI solutions that you design to either your whole organization, which is typically not something you would do unless you have something that's something everyone would want to see. You can share with specific users, or ideally, you would share with Active Directory groups. So you have the ability to create groups in Active Directory, and you can then reference those groups within inside of Power BI. Okay. Now, you can also make it so that the apps that you create are automatically installed for your users. There's an option here that you'll see here in a few moments that can make it automatically install the app for your users. That's just a little checkbox that you can turn on as you get going. Now, to do this, you'll see a lot of the things that you're going to do on the admin side do require Power BI Pro license. And I'm not going to talk a ton about licensing today, other than just say this, that Power BI Pro is the license that costs $10 per month per user. The other option is if your app resides on a Power BI Premium workspace. Okay, and I unfortunately don't have time to get super deep into that. We did talk about Power BI Premium a few moments ago. But if your app resides in a Power BI Premium workspace, then your users that are within inside of that Power BI Premium capacity will also be able to get to it. So generically speaking, a user would need Power BI Pro to be able to get to an app. Unless you're a Power BI Premium customer or you've purchased Power BI Premium, then if they fall under that Power BI Premium license, then they do not need Power BI Pro. Power BI Premium, as the name implies, is more expensive, but it actually can be less expensive when you get to a certain level of users. When you get into the high hundreds or even thousands of users, you want to look at Power BI Premium because it can be more cost effective, especially if you have potentially hundreds, if not thousands of users that are just viewing stuff and not building anything. Okay, we talked about this briefly as well. You can automatically install these apps that you create for your users. There's a little checkbox that you'll see as we get going that allows it to set that up for them. All right, so let's take a look at how we can share our solutions. Now, in my case, here's our workspace on the left-hand side. There's two places you can view workspaces, by the way. You can either view the workspace from the left-hand side here, or if you actually select the webinar workspace that I've created, you can kind of toggle through the collateral that you've created in the top here as well. It's really just your preference. You're seeing the same exact stuff here in the middle of the screen as I am on the left-hand side of the screen over in this section here. Okay. Now, within side of the workspace, you can see that right now we have two items that have been created. We have reports and we have data sets. We actually don't have any dashboards. So if I scroll up to the top here, you'll see no dashboards have been created yet. This is kind of a key difference that I talked about between the Power BI report server, the non-cloud method, and the Power BI service. That's what we're looking at right now, the cloud method. The Power BI service does have dashboard capabilities. I'm not really covering a ton of that today because it's not, I wouldn't consider administration. But the one thing I'll note as far as dashboards that you should be aware of is that dashboards can feed in from multiple reports. So as you look at your reports, you can choose any of the visuals from your reports to be pinned to a dashboard. So as you see in the top right of any one of my visuals here, I have this little pin icon, and I can pin the visuals from my reports to a dashboard. So you could have, say for example, one high-level finance dashboard that it feeds in from multiple finance reports. So maybe I've created this general ledger report, and I've created a accounts receivable report and a few other finance reports, and I all want them to feed into a higher level finance dashboard. You can certainly do that. You can create one dashboard that feeds in from multiple reports, or you can create multiple dashboards even within inside the Power BI service. Okay. Now, there are a couple different ways that you can share your solutions that you create. You can actually share directly to your reports if you wanted to. So you'll see the share option here, both above any reports that you create. You'll also see a share option on dashboards if I actually pen something and create a dashboard. So let's just call this webinar example. This is going to create a dashboard for me. You'll also see the ability within my dashboards to share directly to any dashboards that I create. But the recommended way, at least for the purposes of sharing the full Power BI solution that you've created, the recommended way of sharing solutions is with apps. Now, I have heard some great examples of why people don't use apps, where maybe they've created a workspace that has a lot of different items in it and they just want to share certain items, and so they share directly to a dashboard. Totally understand there's going to be some circumstances where it makes sense to use this option that I'm pointing at right now, where you share directly to a dashboard. But generally speaking, the recommended way of sharing with your users is going to be to create an app, okay? Now, to create an app, you can find the option to create an app by selecting at a high level here, just selecting the workspace. So I need to click on the name of the workspace here to get back to where I can actually create an app. So if I select Webinar Workspace here, you'll see in the top right-hand corner of my screen is the option to publish app, okay? So this is where I can actually create the app that I can then share with others. Now the app, you can only have one app per workspace. So that's one thing to note. You cannot have more than one app per workspace. So what that might make you think is, as you start to strategize how you organize things inside of Power BI, is it might force you to think about how do you want to segment out workspaces. Maybe you actually split out workspaces more frequently than you thought you might, based on the fact that the apps you can only have one app per workspace, okay? So let's kind of walk through this. If I hit the publish app option, I will give the app a name. It already has a name here right now, which is fine. It does require that you provide some kind of a description, so you should provide some good description, because the users that you share this with will find the app that you designed in this app section on the left-hand side. And it's probably a good idea to have some kind of description here so they know what they're selecting before they just jump into it. So you should obviously provide some kind of good description here. I'm just going to put Webinar Workspace description. So not a very good description, but you get the idea. And down below, you can provide things like a support site. So kind of think of this like you know who the subject matter expert is, or maybe you have some documentation on the Power BI project you've done. You could provide a link that gives those users utilizing your app some kind of reference on either who to contact when something doesn't look right, or maybe some reference on what they're looking at. Maybe you have some documentation people can look at. Or you could maybe even just have it so it's a contact capability to reach out to you if there's problems. You can also change the logo and the color. That's just kind of standard capabilities. You can see what that does at the top. That's been there for a while. But what's kind of new, it's been out for the past few months, is this ability to change the navigation. Up in the top in the center area here, you can actually create some navigation so that you can give your users multiple things that they can look at. So for example, if I wanted to, I can create what appear to be kind of folders, but you can create what they call them sections. They're kind of like a folder. And within inside of the section, you can rename this, obviously. So I can rename this to something else. And then I can put things inside of the section as well. So it allows you to kind of create this hierarchy of things that you can look at here. So maybe I call this section my reports, and then I can actually bring into this section, I can drag in different elements into the section. So say, for example, I wanted the Medicare spending reports to show up underneath it. I can move it down, and now it's kind of nested within inside of that section that I've created. So they've added a lot here as far as the app navigation that you can do. Take a look at it, play around with it a bit. You can also add in links if you wanted to. So for example, if I wanted to, I could say, hey, I want to add a link in here, and this link will kind of navigate people to training that I've purchased for them. Obviously, Pragmatic Works sells training, so I can say something like Pragmatic Works training. So that way they have some kind of reference. If they are brand new to Power BI, I can say, hey, go watch the data consumer course that Pragmatic Works offers. So I can send them to pragmaticworkstraining.com. And of course, it does need to be an actual URL. There we go. So just some other nice things that you can add in here. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the last tab now. And what you'll find on the last tab is where you can actually assign permissions to the app that you've designed. So we've created this app, we've created some navigation. Now we can decide who is allowed to actually see this app. You could optionally share it with the entire organization, which is probably not a good idea unless it's something that is really meant to be organization-wide, or you can share with specific users or groups. Now, like I mentioned in the slides earlier, I highly, highly recommend that you don't start sharing with individuals. I recommend that you tap into Active Directory groups that are either already created or ones that you now have created for the purposes of Power BI. The main reason for that is you probably don't want to get in the business of constantly coming into your app and adding new users or removing old users. So if you have a security team that's their main role is to kind of add and remove people from different groups, then you could actually create a group and assign the people that you intend to see this app to that group. And so you don't have to plug in individual users here. I can instead say, hey, I want all of my trainers or all of my consultants to have access to this. So if I type in trainers here, for example, you can see it points me to the trainers group, and I can assign all my trainers now at one single time to this app. Okay. I mentioned on the slides that you can do things like automatically install apps. You'll see that capability here. If I were to check that, this would automatically show up for all of my trainers when they go underneath the app section here. So they wouldn't have to do any extra step that I'm going to show you here in a few moments. If I were to check that off, it would automatically show up for them as well. Okay. There's a few other things here that you can kind of determine whether it makes sense. Really, these are, if you read into them, they're really things that you need to determine are best for your business. So things like allow users to make a copy of the reports in the app. I may or may not want to allow that. You can certainly uncheck that as you go through here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and publish the app. And it says it takes about 5 to 10 minutes, but I have never seen it take more than a minute, honestly. I guess they're kind of preparing you for the worst here. But the app published successfully, and then I can take this link and share it with any users that I now want to have access to the app. The other thing now, from the user's perspective, what they will see is they will need to come to the app section. You either provide that link to them that we just saw a moment ago, or they would go to the apps section. So imagine this is your user now, and your user would then go into and search for the app that you created. So in the top right, once you get into the apps section here, in the top right, you can select Get App. And from within inside of here, we should be able to find the app that we just created. Now you can search for them here if you wanted to. So I can search for webinar. There it is. Webinar Workspace. That's the app that we created. I should have given it a better name, obviously. But I can now select that and make that app part of what I'm able to see now going forward. So I can select Get It Now. And then this app will now appear in my apps section here that I can select from after a second or two. There it is. And again, this is from my user perspective. They would either take the link that I provided, or they would go to the Get App section to find it. And they can favorite it. They can edit I can edit. They can't really edit. But they can go into the Webinar Workspace app that we've created, and they can see on the left-hand side the navigation that we've created, so including the link that we provided. And you can also see the section here and how that works with inside the report app that we've created, or the Workspace app that we've created. Okay. So we can go into our actual reports here and start to look at them. This is the perspective of what our users will see. Now you also have some capability that's fairly recently been released that allows you to do some custom branding to your tenant. We'll talk about that as we get into the admin portal. So the Power BI admin portal here, you do need to be a Power BI admin to actually see anything of substance in there. You might be able to actually see this and click on it, but not see anything relevant in there. But inside the admin portal, you can do kind of your own custom branding where you can change the color that you see on the top here that's in black right now. You can also replace you can put an image in the top right. You have some new custom branding stuff that you can do that I think you'll see extend over time, but right now it's pretty basic. Since I already talked about it, let me just show you where it's at. It's underneath the admin portal here. And you'll see on the very bottom section here, there is a custom branding section that you can upload a logo. You can change the kind of cover image, so you can actually have an image kind of showing up here, and you can change the colors that's used as well. And you can always remove any custom branding that you've done before if you decide you need to revert it back. Okay. Now, again, if you select the little cog up here at the top and you select admin portal and you don't see some of the stuff I'm seeing here, that means you need your Office 365 administrator to make you a Power BI admin if you really need to get into this area. There's a few other things that we'll talk about here towards the end of our webinar. All right, let's revert back to the slides for a moment. So we talked about sharing collaboration being intended to be done through the apps section. Now we're going to talk about a slightly different topic here, more around the data level security capabilities. So within inside of Power BI, you have the ability to secure the data at a row level, where you can make it so that when a user logs in, they only see the rows of data that are relevant to them. Okay, to do that, it's really a two-step process. You need to create a role within inside of the Power BI desktop. So you have the Power BI desktop that you can define a role and define what your users will be allowed to see. And then the second step is in the Power BI service. So in the Power BI service, you can then assign what users, or ideally groups, should be assigned to that role that you define inside the Power BI desktop. Okay, so two steps. You have to go to the Power BI desktop first. Then once you make your changes in the Power BI desktop to create the role, then you deploy to the service, and then from the Power BI service, you can assign either users or groups to that role that you created. Now, I have done a webinar on this before, a full hour webinar on security. And so I do want to reference you to this webinar that you may want to go watch at a later time. You can see it's almost a full hour on just RowLevel Security. I'm going to show you a very simple example for today because I have a few other things I want to touch on for today. But if you're really interested in RowLevel Security, this is on YouTube. This is you can search for setting up Power BI RowLevel Security, and I did a full hour on like 5 or 6 different scenarios that people run into with RowLevel Security. So if that's something that really interests you, I recommend taking a look at that after today. For today's purposes, I'm going to give you at least a basic example, so it gives you an idea of where to get started. And then if you're really interested in going a step further, I recommend looking at that webinar. Okay, so we're going to actually create, and we've kind of already talked about this, we're going to create a row level security model, a data level security model within inside the Power BI desktop that restricts the rows that my users are allowed to see based on their login. So when they go to log in, it's going to look and verify whether or not they have the access needed to be able to see the data. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop over and do a quick demonstration of this, and we're going to do that demo through the Power BI desktop first. So again, this is a two-step process. The first step starts in the Power BI desktop, and then your last step ends in the Power BI service. So the first step here is we're going to define what are my users going to be allowed to see, okay? And then we'll deploy it to the Power BI service, and then we'll tell it which users are allowed to see those things, okay? So first step, we're gonna go underneath the modeling ribbon on the very top, and underneath the modeling ribbon, you'll see there's a section here devoted to security where we can actually define or manage a security role. So I'm gonna go ahead and select Manage Role. And in this case, it looks like I already have a security model created on this one. I'm going to go ahead and delete that just so we can look at this from square one here. All right. So let's say, for example, that I want to secure this data model which we're looking at right now by county. So this is data all surrounding different counties of healthcare data within the state of Florida. So we're looking at healthcare data in the state of Florida, and you can see on the left-hand side, I have a ton of different counties to choose from. That's what this slicer in the top left is. It's filtering based on the county. And so what I want to do is I want to create a role where I can make sure that the user that's logging in only sees the data that they're allowed or should be allowed to see. So to do that, again, we'll select Manage Roles. We'll create a role. And for this example, I'm going to go ahead and create this one to be my Duval County, which is the county that Jacksonville is in. I'll make this my Duval County role. And then I need to choose the column within inside my data model that has the county that I want to filter on. So I'm going to find that inside my hospital general information here. And I'm going to add a filter to that table based on the county name. So I have a county name column here, and when I select that, it's going to give me kind of this empty or a template here where I can replace the word value with whatever the real value is that I want to base the filter on. So if I want to filter on Duval County, then I would type in Duval. All right, so let me unzoom for a moment here and hit save. And that's really all you have to do in here for this very simple example. Again, I referenced that 1 hour webinar where I go much more in depth. I'd recommend taking a look at that if you have more complex security designs that you're interested in doing. But for the simple one, I'll go ahead and hit save. And it's going to save that role within inside of my data model. Now you can certainly see that right now I can still see all of the counties over here. Duval County is part of this, but it's not restricted to just that county yet. That's because I haven't actually tested the security model out yet. If I want to test this out, then you can do so by going up to the section here where it says View as Roles right here. And if you select View as Roles, this allows you to test out the security that we just created. So I can say, hey, I want to test this out as if I was logging in as a user that has access to the Duval County role. So if I select that and hit OK, it's now going to revert my report to only show Duval County. Now, one thing to note is my report was previously filtered to only show Hillsborough County, which is in the Tampa area. And so you'll notice right now my report's not showing anything, but that's just because the value here is selected on something that is not available to me. So I would have to select Duval, or I could have had select all chosen. And then when I do, you'll see Hillsborough goes away. I can't even select it anymore. And I only see the hospitals that exist within inside of that particular county, okay? So it looks like my security role is working. You can even see up in the top here, it says you're now viewing this report as the Duval County role. If you want to stop viewing it as that, you can always hit stop viewing. You could also notice here that you cannot select any other county from the list. That's the only one you're allowed to see. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and hit stop viewing to revert this back. And I can now see all counties again once I tell it I wanna stop testing the role. Now, one thing that you should be aware of when it comes to setting up and defining roles is that it's highly dependent on your data model relationships that you have. So if you look at the relationships inside this model, you can see it's a pretty simple model. It only has 2 tables, but there is a relationship defined between those 2 tables. And it's key that the relationships are defined correctly. If they're not, then you could see issues when it comes to your security model. In some cases, maybe people don't see as much as they should. Maybe in some cases they see too much, but generally it's going to be they don't see as much as they should, or the results come back incorrectly. So the relationships are a key part of defining your roles. All right, so we've actually, our relationships are pretty simple in this case. We've defined a role. We're now ready to republish this, so publish this back off to the Power BI service a second time. So we'll go to the home ribbon and hit publish again. And I'll go ahead and save this locally first. And then we'll save it to the Power BI service. You'll note here that it is replacing the existing data set that already exists out there. That is okay, so we'll hit replace to replace the data set we already created. And then once that's done, we'll hop over to the Power BI service for that step 2 that I talked about, which is the assigning users to your role, okay? All right, so let's go over here to the workspace that we've created called Webinar Workspace. And if we want to actually assign users to that role, we would go to our data set. You can either go to it here in the top menu, or you can go to it on the left-hand menu. Either way works. And then from here, we're going to tell it that we want to manage the security of this data set. So I'll select security. You can also do that from the left-hand side, by the way. So if I prefer to use the left-hand navigation, you can hit the little open menu here, and you could select security here as well. It takes you to the same place. Okay. Now you can see we have 1 role available to us. You could have as many roles as you want, so you can define as many roles as you want. But if you really have a complex data security scenario, I would recommend taking a look at that other webinar where I talked through a bunch of different scenarios where you would have the ability to secure in a more advanced scenario. I'll just leave it at that for now. All right, so I want to make sure that only people that have access to the Duval County role, or that should have access to the Duval County role, can see that data. So once you select the role, you can see on the right-hand side that you would then assign users, or again, ideally groups, to that role. So I could type in an individual user here, which again is not ideal, or I can reference that group that I've already defined or used previously, the trainers group, to say that people that are part of the trainers group only have certain access to this report. All right, or certain data access, I should say. All right, so I'll add this and hit save. And now that I've done that, I can test this out one more time, but from the Power BI service now. So if I want to test this out again, you'll see up in the role itself, there's a little ellipsis you can select here called more options, and I can test this role out once more from the Power BI service. And I do recommend doing this from here because there's some added benefit from doing it from the Power BI service. Let me show you what I mean. If I select test as role, I can now test as individual users. So say, for example, I want to verify that one of the people that is in the trainer's role only has the access they should have. I can validate that. The way I can test that out is I can go up to the now viewing as Duval County role here, and I can instead change this and say, well, I actually want to test it as a specific user that was part of that trainer's group that we just assigned to it here. So say, for example, if that's the case, I would actually type in one of the users that I know is part of that group. So Mitchell Pearson, hit apply. And now I'm logged in as Mitchell, and I'm seeing only the things he should be allowed to see. And in his case, he must not be part of that group. I thought he was. So in his case, he's actually allowed to see everything. If I chose a different user, then they would actually see the specific things that they're supposed to see. So if I had actually, let's try one more here, one more use case here. Let's try Daniel, straight if, hit apply. And it looks like Daniel is part of the Duval County group. So Daniel only sees the one county, whereas Mitchell is not part of the group. I thought he was, but Mitchell is not part of the group, but Daniel is, so he only sees the role he's allowed to see, okay? So it's nice to test where you could actually plug in a specific user, so that way you can say, hey, here's what they're actually going to see whenever they go to log in. The other thing to note when it comes to security in Power BI is that if you have a user that's part of multiple roles, they're going to see the accumulation of both roles. So if I made it so Daniel can see Duval County role, but he can also see Hillsborough County role, then he's going to be able to see both of them. It's not like it has to pick a winner. It actually brings back everything for him. He'd be able to see both. And whichever one gives him higher access, so if there's one that gives him additional permissions, like an admin permission, then he's going to see everything. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so that's kind of data level security. I see there's a bunch of questions. I'll make sure we save some time here towards the end to be able to address a bunch of the questions. It looks like we have about 10 minutes left here. So let's hop over to my last section here. Last section we're going to talk about is all around data refresh. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to data refresh. In fact, let me go ahead and launch one extra instance of the Power BI desktop here to talk about one other thing. So when it comes to data refresh, depending on where your data is at, you may or may not be required to install this thing I have on my screen here called a data gateway. You can see a screenshot for it here. I also have the actual data gateway that I have installed that you'll see right here. The purpose of the data gateway is to be able to secure on-premises data, so data sources that are stored somewhere on your network, okay, that are not in the cloud. The data gateway is in charge of transmitting securely the data from those on-premises data sources into the Power BI service, which is a cloud service. So it's all about moving securely data from your on-premises data gateway or on-premises data sources into your cloud service, okay? Now, do you always need a data gateway? No, there's actually some circumstances you don't need a data gateway, and it's mainly dependent on where your data is stored. So if your data is already stored in Microsoft's cloud, say for example, you're using OneDrive for Business, or you're using SharePoint Online, or maybe you're even using Azure as a data source, like Azure SQL Database, for example, then you do not need a data gateway because your data is already in Microsoft's cloud. Now, if you're using something like AWS, that's Amazon's cloud, that does not count. If your data is already in Microsoft's cloud, you do not need to have a data gateway, at least for that data source. If you have another data source that is in the cloud, that is not in the cloud, I should say, then you do need a data gateway. Okay, and the data gateway, again, is in charge of bringing data out of your on-premise data sources and bringing it into the cloud service, okay? All right, so the data gateway is something that you'll install somewhere on your network, ideally not on your personal laptop or anyone's personal laptop. The reason for that is because the data gateway has to be obviously turned on, ready to go whenever your scheduled data refreshes occur. So if I have a scheduled data refresh that's set for 2 a.m. and my data gateway is on a laptop that's asleep overnight, then it's not going to be able to refresh the data because it's going to go try and attempt to pull from a data gateway that's not turned on at the moment. So typically what you'll see larger enterprises do is they'll install a data gateway on its own devoted virtual machine, okay? That's ideal, is have it on its own dedicated virtual machine. And then Microsoft does have some recommended resources as far as what kind of RAM you should provide to it, what kind of processor it should have. Microsoft has some resources on that you can look up just to know what it really should have. One thing to note is the data gateway does not need to be installed on the same server as the data source itself. So if you have, say for example, an on-premises SQL server that your data source is that is your data source for Power BI, you do not necessarily need to install the data gateway on that exact same server. You can have a different server as long as that data gateway can connect to the data source and pull in data from it, then you're in good shape, okay? All right, now, the other thing to consider when it comes to data refresh, which I want to show you here, and give me a second for this to pop up here. There we go. The other thing to consider is how did you choose to store your data? Okay, now either way, either method you choose here, if your data is on premises, then you still need a data gateway, but I do want to talk about these two different options. The default option when you're going to connect to data sources like SQL Server, for example, is to import data into Power BI. That means that Power BI is actually going to physically take the data from your SQL Server and import it into Power BI to store it in Power BI's proprietary format called xVelocity. There's some benefits to that. It means that your reports are going to run faster. It's an in-memory technology that can return report results very quickly. But there's some downsides. So let's talk pro-con here. So let's say pro-con of import versus direct query. The pro of import, and let me give myself a little bit more space here. The pro of importing data is the performance. The performance of your reports is going to be by far the fastest, generally speaking. There's some caveats to that, but generally speaking, your reports are going to perform the fastest if you import your data into Power BI because it's using Power BI's in-memory technology. Now, the exception to that is maybe you're connecting to another in-memory technology already that has more RAM assigned to it and can be just as fast, if not faster, than the import option. But generally speaking, it's going to perform faster to use the import option for Power BI. The con here, or the downside of this, is you're then going to have data latency, meaning that your reports are going to need some mechanism to update the data. Because if you use the data import option, that means the data is brought into Power BI and it's going to be static, or the data is going to be stale until you set up some kind of method for doing data refresh, and that's what we're going to talk about here in a moment. Now, the direct query option, potentially, generally speaking, again, I'm trying to make some general statements here, generally speaking, is going to have worse performance, generally. So, poor performance, okay? So there's some exceptions to all these things, but generally speaking, you're gonna have worse performance when you use direct query than you will if you're using the import option. Now on the con side, you have, I did that wrong. The con is poor performance. That's not a pro, obviously. The pro is there's no data latency, because you're always pointing, with direct query, you're always pointing to the direct data source. And because you're pointing to the direct data source, there is no requirement to do data refreshes. You do not need to schedule data refreshes if you're using direct query. So con, I already mentioned, poor performance. Okay, sorry, I did that a little backwards a moment ago. Okay, so little pro con, you got to choose what's most important to you. Do you need your data all the way up to date, or do you up to the second up to date, or is it okay if you get your data refreshed every 24 hours or every 8 hours or something like that? If it's okay for your data to be, a little stale, like a couple hours stale, then I would definitely recommend the import option from the perspective of you get the performance gain of the in-memory xVelocity engine. Now, there's some other reasons why people might choose direct query as well. That gets into like data volume and things like that. I'm going to leave that alone for now because I do want to, with the last few minutes we have here, go actually walk you through setting up our data refresh. But it's good to know your options here when it comes to import versus direct query. So again, if we had chosen direct query, I don't need to actually set up a data refresh, but because I did do import in the scenario we're looking at now, I need to set up some mechanism to refresh my data. I also need to have that data gateway installed that we talked about, which I do have ready to go. So all we would need to do is go over to my data set on the left-hand side here. Let's see, where did it go? Here, let's click on this and find it a little easier. So I'll go to my data set, and then I'll need to set up a scheduled refresh under the schedule refresh options area here. All right, so from the schedule refresh area, I can then define which data gateway will be used for this example. And I have a data gateway already configured. And if you notice the name of it, I actually created it as part of a Power Apps class. The data gateway is used both in Power BI, Power Apps, and Flow, as well as Logic Apps. And so in my case here, I already have a data gateway that I'm using for my Power Apps class that I can also use for Power BI. And I would tell it and reference into it here which of my data sources that I want to connect into and which one of these I want to wire up to be able to use for my schedule refresh. All right, so I'll then scroll down a little bit and you'll see there are some other things that you can kind of tap in here, like parameters. That one has some capabilities if you're doing things like Power BI Premium. But we want to actually define our scheduled refresh here. And I, of course, yes, want to define a refresh option. So I'll turn that on. And here's some areas where I think there could be some improvement over time. Right now, you can only either refresh daily or weekly. You know, maybe you want to only refresh monthly. Well, that's not an option right now. But you can choose daily or weekly as of right now. And then the other limitation that you have is if you're using Power BI Pro, you can also set up, Power BI Pro can only refresh up to 8 times a day. So you are limited to the number of times you can refresh if you're using Power BI Pro. If you go under here, you can actually start to add different times that you want it to refresh. So maybe I want a 10 a.m. refresh and a 2 p.m. refresh. If you're using Power BI Pro, you are limited to up to 8 times a day that you can set up your refresh. Now, if you're using Power BI Premium, then you can refresh up to 48 times a day. So you actually have additional refreshes that you can do if you're using Power BI Premium, okay? Power BI Premium can also store additional data. So Power BI Premium has a larger storage space that you can use than Power BI Pro. So really you probably want to kind of evaluate and see if it makes sense based on number of users and features, whether Power BI Premium, makes most sense for you. Now, once I have that, I set up my 2 refreshes that I want for the week or the daily schedule here. I can then also provide an email of who I want to be notified whenever there's a failure of said refresh. So maybe I want to notify myself, probably makes sense, or a group. You could also email a group, and then hit apply to make sure that I've saved those settings for my data refresh. The data refresh settings are actually pretty simple. I'd like to see a little bit more advancement in this area over time. But for now, that's what we have as far as scheduling refresh. Okay. All right. So while I take some questions, because we're out of time, while I take some questions, let me go ahead and put my contact details back on the screen here, just in case you want to reach back out to me. I'll just put this slide back up right here. And then let me take a few questions here before we end. Okay. So let's see. Can we provide access to dashboards who are in different subscriptions outside the organization? Okay, so yes, so this question was from Mahesh. He's asking around kind of access to users outside your organization. You can do that. It is possible to share outside your organization. One of the things that you have to do if you choose to basically share outside your organization is you would have to federate, this is something your Office 365 administrator would look into more, is you would have to federate your tenant with their tenant. So basically you have to couple each other together. You have to marry each other a little bit. And once you do that, you can then make it so that those that are part of another organization can see Power BI reports. Now, if those users already have a Power BI Pro license assigned to them, they can continue to use that Power BI Pro license inside of your organization. If they do not have a Power BI Pro license, then that cost would be shifted to you. So that's one thing to be aware of as well. Oftentimes what I'm seeing for folks that are sharing outside the organization is they're looking at doing things like Power BI Premium, where they can have a lot of their outside organization users covered under some of the free viewer licenses that they get with Power BI Premium. Let's see, let me go back up to the top here, see what other questions we had. Oh, a lot of questions. One person, thank you, Donald. Donald corrected me. I think I said early on that the Microsoft Store versus Windows Store, they've now named it Microsoft Store, as something I mentioned earlier. I think Nancy asked this, can you turn off dedicated capacity option for certain groups? So yeah, you can. So if you want certain groups of users to not have the ability to turn on Power BI Premium for a workspace, you can do that. And that's actually the case for me. So in my case, my user account does not have the ability to turn on Power BI Premium for a workspace. The other thing that comes into play is you can have certain workspaces that have Power BI Premium and other workspaces not. So if there's some workspaces that you need the features of Power BI Premium while others you don't, then you can actually choose to turn that on for certain workspaces while you do not on others. Let's see, can you add a group of administrators instead of a specific user? We actually started adding, oh, those are two separate questions. So I believe you can. So this was a question from Peter Grant. So Peter asked the question, and I want to validate it. Why not test it here, just to validate that what I'm going to tell you is true. He asked the question, can you assign groups of users to be the admin rather than actually just assigning an individual user? So in my case, I assigned a user here. Let's test that theory out. So I have trainers as a group, and I want to make trainers the admin. Let's see if for any reason it does not allow me to do that. No, looks like it does. So to Peter's question, yes, you can assign a group as an admin of that workspace. Again, the context of how we were talking about this is I recommend that you have some kind of a backup plan for when you go on vacation, right? You're not there for a week and you need someone to be able to manage those data refreshes that occur, and maybe occasionally they fail. You need someone to actually be able to go in and correct issues or correct problems. So making them an admin allows them to kind of go in and do that. Let's see, we have a question. Any recommendation, the metadata of the Medicare? Yeah, so this is actually an issue I noticed popped up. This is from Corinna here. She noticed that on, and by the way, I don't have a good answer for you, but she noticed that I believe it's on my app. Let's see. Where was it, Corinna? So Corinna noticed that there was somewhere in the metadata that it said baseball demo. And I noticed that pop up fairly recently as well. And I think that is a current bug with some of the new stuff that they've released. I have seen it before. I'm not able to regenerate it here. And it sounds like you guys must have noticed it on my screen at some point as well. But you saw at some point it popped up on my screen where it actually said baseball demo up the top when it really has nothing to do with that. That is a current little bug that I found popping up, and for some reason I'm not able to regenerate it right now. But I have seen that as well. It sounds like it must have been on my screen at some point. That's definitely a bug. So I would expect a fix to come with that. Okay, well, we're about 5 minutes after. We had a ton of questions here. What I'll try and do is I'll see if this is something I can work up a blog to answer some questions from. Thank you guys for joining today. Appreciate you spending some time with me. Hopefully this was helpful. It gave you some good ideas as far as how you can, things you can consider when it comes to administration of Power BI. Let me know, of course, you can email me. I'll put my contact info back up here once more before we end. And thanks again for joining.
All right, thank you, Devin, so much for hosting. And like Devin said, if you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to him or myself. You guys will receive the recording in your email tomorrow, probably around noon, so please look out for that. And thank you guys so much for joining. And if you guys have any questions or want to look into some of the events that we have going on, please visit pragmaticworks.com and check out our events calendar. We have tons and tons of new stuff coming up. So thank you so much again, guys, for joining. You guys have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.